Well, good morning, everybody. Now, let's be honest, it's not a good morning. Does anybody else take daylight savings time personally, or is it just me? This is like my least favorite day of the whole year. I think when Martha and I, when we sort of emerged from the valley of the diapers with our 4 kids, I've just realized that when somebody takes an hour of sleep from me, it's just hard to let that go. Anyway, but there are some good things about it. It's a hard day in some reasons, but there are some positives, especially when you stand up where I stand, because I'm guessing in about 25 minutes, we're going to start seeing people show up for the 9:30 service who forgot to set their clocks. So anyway, life's a mixed bag. You find the little joys where you can. It really is good to be back with you guys. As I'm sure you heard last week, the staff and the elders, we got away for kind of a yearly planning retreat. And while it is wonderful to have an opportunity to get away and think and plan and dream about, kind of where God is leading us in the future, it's also just always great to be back with you all. I'm grateful to Rick, who did a great job last week talking about Psalm 61 and how God is really greater than any of the burdens that we may carry around with us. And this morning, we're continuing on in that same teaching series where we're going back to the Old Testament book of Psalms. And each week, we're just sort of picking one of those psalms, one of those ancient poems or songs of the people of Israel, and just digging into it together to see what it can teach us about God and about ourselves and what it looks like to live well for Him. And so far in this series, each week has kind of looked at a different topic. They kind of stand alone in that sense. But there is sort of a theme, I think, that ties it all together. It's a theme that unites the book of Psalms as a whole. And that theme is that God really is greater than any struggle we may face in our life. Whatever it is that we may come up against, we can trust that God in His goodness and His love and His power is greater than what we are facing. So, for example, in the last few weeks, we've looked at how God is greater than our failures, and He's greater than our fears, and even greater than the confusion that we might have about prayer and how we interact with Him. And this morning, I want to invite you to turn in the Bible to Psalm 55, and we're going to look together at how God is greater than our hurts, right? God is greater than the things that hurt us, the wounds that we carry inside. If it would help you for any reason, there are some red Bibles in the seats in front of you, and you can grab one of those and turn to the page number that's listed on the screen so that at least we can kind of be on the same page together as we read this psalm. But as you're turning there, I want to invite you to do something. I'd like for each one of us to take just a moment and stop and reflect back on our lives. And I just want you to identify a time when you really felt like you got hurt deeply by somebody that you trusted. I mean, unfortunately for us, a lot of us, we may have lots and lots of examples of that to choose from. But just really stop and think about that. For you, maybe it was a parent who wasn't there for you in the way that you needed him to be. Maybe it was a spouse where things didn't work out, or a friend who turned their back on you. Maybe it was something that happened at work, an employer who didn't treat you the way he should have, or an employee who left to start their own company and took some of your clients with them. Maybe for you, it was something that happened in a church. Like I said, unfortunately, for a lot of us, we may have a lot of different things to choose from. But I want us to each just take a moment and identify one thing, one hurt that we want to think about as an example as we talk this morning. Does everybody have something? Okay. Now, I'm going to go out on a limb and guess that if there's one thing that kind of ties all of our different stories together, right? There's a lot of people in this room, a lot of different examples that we're thinking of. The common thread that might run through all of those is the idea of betrayal, right? If we have lived on earth for any amount of time, sooner or later, we're going to feel betrayed by somebody that we've trusted, somebody that we love, somebody that has hurt, that we care about. And, I think betrayal is sort of a unique and a uniquely painful kind of hurt. Because, I mean, if you think about it, if you've got a kid at school who's a jerk to you, and he's always a jerk to you, and he's a jerk to you yet again, I mean, it hurts that he's mean, but you kind of expect that. You see that coming. You know that's how it's going to be. But when somebody that you love or that you trust puts a knife in your back, that's just a different kind of pain, right? That's a harder sort of thing to get over. It's more of a struggle, I think. That's why William Blake, who is an English poet, he phrased it up this way in one of his poems. He said, "It is easier to forgive an enemy than to forgive a friend." You guys ever experienced that? There's some truth to what he's saying there, right? It's easier to forgive an enemy sometimes than it is to forgive a friend. So if betrayal is this kind of unique and uniquely painful kind of hurt, well, what does the Bible have to say about that? And what does the book of Psalms have to say about that? Well, it turns out quite a bit, because I think that Psalm 55 is actually about what happened to the life of one man, King David, when he felt like he was betrayed, when he had been hurt deeply by a friend. And you even see this, right? As you look at the psalm, before you even get to the part where it says verse 1, it mentions that it is a psalm of David. Now, that identifies that David, one of the early kings of Israel, wrote this. And sometimes in those little introductions to the Psalms, they kind of let you know what was going on. They tell you the historical setting, what was going on in David's life when he wrote this poem. And it helps you kind of understand where he's coming from in the poem. But here, it doesn't have that. But it's interesting because many of the people over the years who study this and have read it and read what it says, and they kind of look at the words he says in the poem and they compare it to the events that we know from his life, they think it was written at a time when David was betrayed by a really close friend and a trusted advisor. So let me kind of real briefly tell you that story to set the stage for what we're about to read. It takes place near the end of David's reign, right? So King David was the second king of Israel. He reigned about 1000 BC, so we're about 3,000 years ago from where we are in this moment. David is reigning. He reigned for a long time, and near the end of his reign, as often happens, he's getting older, he's getting weaker, kind of the wheels start to come off the bus a little bit. And David makes a series of incredibly poor decisions that really poison his relationships with his children. And one of his sons, a guy named Absalom, decides that it is time for David to go. Now, Absalom is a very popular young man. Like, the people love him. He's just sort of a charismatic personality. But he decides that it's time for him to take his dad's throne. So he basically launches a coup to drive his dad from power. And when he declares himself and what it is that he's going to do, one of David's most trusted advisors, a close friend, this wise guy that he had, a man named Ahithophel, decides that he is going to pull back from David and he's going to kind of cast his lots with Absalom. He's going to go over to his side, help Absalom take the throne and really say, this is what I'm driving at here. And this is the moment that most people, when they read this psalm, they think this is the particular betrayal, the hurt that David is talking about, that he's praying about and that he's addressing here as we go through Psalm 55. So what I want us to do is just kind of start reading through it together with that kind of possible background in mind, and we'll just see how that plays out. So look how David starts. In verse 1, he says this. He says, "Listen to my prayer, O God. Do not ignore my plea. Hear me and answer me. My thoughts trouble me, and I'm distraught because of what my enemy is saying, because of the threats of the wicked. For they bring down suffering on me, and they assail me in their anger." Now again, to me, I think that he's talking about this story. In 2 Samuel, when they relate what happens when Absalom begins his coup, David realizes that he's got to run for his life, right? He literally, if he stays in the city, they're going to kill him. So he's got a few kind of trusted friends who stick with him, and they gather up what they can. And as they're physically leaving the city of Jerusalem, right, running for their lives, all of David's enemies, right, the people who never would have said a bad thing about him when he was in power, but when they realize that he's on the way out, they take advantage of that to kind of come out and line the streets and taunt him and mock him as he goes. And I think maybe that's the kind of experience David is talking about here. This is sort of the moment for him. And I want us to keep reading in verse 4, but as we do that, I want you to ask yourself this question. The words that we're about to read, have you ever felt this way before? Have you ever thought these things? Have you ever said these things, especially when you were really deep in that moment of being hurt? So look what David says in verse 4. He says, "My heart is in anguish within me. The terrors of death have fallen on me. Fear and trembling have beset me. Horror has overwhelmed me. I said, oh, that I had the wings of a dove. I would fly away and I would be at rest. I would flee far away and stay in the desert. I would hurry to my place of shelter, far from the tempest and the storm." Again, I can't speak for you all, but I've felt this way more often than I would want to admit. When you feel hurt, when you feel like somebody's betrayed, you feel like the ground is just giving way underneath you, right? My heart is in anguish. That's a line that maybe we relate to, that we resonate with. And I can't tell you how many times that I've prayed the same thing he prays here. God, if there was any way, if I had the wings of a bird and I could fly away and leave this hurt and the pain and the sorrow behind me, I would do it in a heartbeat. God, is there any way you can get me out of this? Right? We know that. We've felt that. And friends, that's one of the things that I absolutely love about the Bible. Right? I love the fact that the Bible is full of people that we can relate to, that they feel what we feel, they say what we say. I think sometimes it's really easy for us to look at the Bible and think, this was written thousands of years ago in another language. I don't know what I've got in common with some of those people. Use David as an example. David was a king, right? Michelangelo made a statue out of David. No one has ever made a statue out of me, right? And nobody thinks that I'm a king, although my last name, I guess, is King, but that's different. But, sometimes we look at these people and we're like, gosh, they lived so long ago. I mean, they're like nomads and they're goat herders. What do I have in common with these people? Why am I reading their stories as if they have something to say to me today? Well, this is the reason why, right? We can learn from the stories of the people in the Bible because the people in the Bible are people we can relate to. They think what we think. They felt what we've felt. They express their hearts just like we express our hearts. And because there's that commonality, we can really learn from them, positively and negatively by example. When I think about this, I actually think about a saying that my granddad used to give a lot. I had one of those granddads who was just full of sayings. I don't know if any of you had a granddad like that. All the time. Just random stuff you never hear anymore, like yonder. Did anybody else have a granddad who said yonder? Hey, granddad, I'm not sure where I left my book. He's like, oh, it's over yonder, Michael. Like, all of you guys are just like, nope. So anyway, I guess that was just granddad in Central Virginia. That's kind of a yonder place. But he had another saying that he used all the time. All the time we would be talking and he'd say, Mike, you got to remember, that guy puts his pants on one leg at a time, just like you. And he said this some of you guys have heard that. He said this all the time. Finally, eventually, I was like, Granddad, where did you learn that? And I don't know if this is actually true or not, but this is the story I remember from my granddad. So my granddad was a Marine in World War II. Young guy, right? 19, 20 years old, something like that. He goes into basic training. And near the end of his time in basic, he's there, and this general happens to be on the base. And this general is a guy who is this decorated hero from World War I. Larger than life, this sort of grizzled man's man. And he's walking by, and my young nobody, granddad is looking at him, and like his jaw just drops, looking at this guy like, wow, that guy, I could never be the kind of soldier that guy is. And his drill sergeant or commanding officer, whoever it was at the time, he called my granddad over and said, hey, you need to listen up. I know you see that guy and you think, wow, he's done so much to accomplish so much. But when I'm in a situation where I'm tested, am I going to respond the way he did? Here's what I need you to remember. The general puts his pant legs on one leg at a time, just like you. Right? He may look like he's big and you could never sort of do what he did, but you've got a lot more in common with that guy than you think. At your heart, you're not all that different. And Granddad used that line over and over and over again when I was growing up. And he would use it both ways, right? Positive and negative. Like sometimes we would, my sister and I, we'd watch the news with him or something, and you see these stories about people who are doing tremendous things with their life, and they're changing the world, and they're, fighting famine in Africa and doing all of this, and you almost think like, well, gosh, how is my little life ever going to measure up to that? And I think my granddad would hear us say those kinds of things, and he said, hey, no, Michael and Tammy, you need to remember, those people put their pants on one leg at a time, just like you, right? There's no reason you can't do the same things that they're doing, the kind of things that they're doing. You're not that different than them. But he also used it as sort of a cautionary tale, too, for the times where my sister and I would feel like we're getting a little bit too big for our britches, which was another granddad saying, by the way. But, we would look at like people who made these big, mess-ups with their life. And he said, hey, remember, that guy puts his pants on one leg at a time, just like you. Don't think you're so different from them that you're going to be able to avoid the difficulties they have, that you're not sort of running the danger of making the same kinds of mistakes that he made. And again, that's why I think the Bible is just so applicable to our lives, because the Bible is full of people who put their pants on one leg at a time. Even though most of them didn't wear pants, right? But it just doesn't work well to say you put your robe on one leg at a time. But the truth is, they're just like us, right? They're just not that different than us. We can relate to them. And because we can relate to them, we can learn from them. The Bible is full of people who are just like you and me. And sometimes they're really noble and they're wonderful examples to follow. Like King David's a good example of that. There were times when he just knocked it out of the park and we would do well to imitate him. And then there are some times when they don't do things so well. And they're not examples that we need to follow, right? I don't think any of us would want to take a parenting class from King David because he was a train wreck as a father. But, he's there. There's positives and negatives. In fact, David, he's a great example, too, that sometimes he just says things to God that are just so ugly. You're just sort of shocked they're in there. If you can, skip down a few verses here in Psalm 55 and look at this. Look at what he says in verse 15. He says, let death take my enemies by surprise. Let them go down alive to the realm of the dead, for evil finds lodging among them. Now, I have been very hurt by people over the years and have been very upset and have prayed some things that are not particularly kind. But I'm not sure that I've ever said, God, I want you to take that person who hurt me and I want you to drag them alive to hell so that they can experience that as a living person. Like that's rough, right? But that's what David says. It's not particularly righteous or holy or even helpful. but it's honest. I mean, we get a picture of how he really feels in the moment. And we relate to that because we really feel things like that at times. My wife Martha tells a story. When she was growing up, she was probably middle school age. She really had a hard time because of what today we would call mean girls or bullies, things like that. So she grew up in South America, went to this British Chilean private high school. And it was one of those things where when she was there was a group of girls that just really made it their job to make sure that they were always on the inside and that Martha knew that she didn't fit on the inside, that she was always on the outside. They bent over backwards to make her know that she wasn't welcome and that she wasn't good enough. And that hurt, as you can imagine. And one of the ways that Martha would console herself when she would come home and she was just experiencing this pain so deeply is she would think, well, you know what? At least I'm going to spend eternity in heaven with Jesus, and they're going to burn in hell. Now, Martha gave me permission to tell that story because it's not the most flattering story, right? And she doesn't think that way anymore, but God sort of met her where she was and brought her along. But that's the thing. Right? We think these kind of things too. You know, we see them sometimes in the Bible and we're like, oh, I can't believe somebody would say that. I don't know. Well, we do. Because we think these things, because we feel these things, we can relate to the people in the Bible. We can relate to their story, and because we relate to them, we can learn from them. And because David does this kind of stuff, I relate to him. I see myself in his life and his emotions and the way he thinks and he feels. And because of that, there's real value in learning. So here's what I want us to do. Remembering that we can learn from his example, even though he's a king and we're not. Let's look at verse 12 at what he says. Because it's here that he starts talking about the actual hurt and the betrayal that he has experienced. So he says, look, if an enemy were insulting me, I could endure it. Right? If a foe were rising against me, I could hide. Right? You know, if the neighbor who's always being nasty to me continued to be nasty to me, that would hurt. But I would expect that. I would see it coming because that's how they did it. But it's not an enemy that's done this to me. It's my friend God, and it hurts. And then in verse 13, he makes this interesting change. He's not talking to God anymore. He starts to address the person who betrayed him directly. And look at what he says. He says, but it's you. It's a man like myself, my companion, my close friend, with whom I once enjoyed fellowship at the house of God as we walked among the worshipers. Right? He's talking to me, so you were just like me. We didn't just have a friendship in common. We had a faith in common. We went deep in these things. And that's why it hurts so much when you've betrayed me. That's why David can say, my heart is in anguish within me. And it's really at that point that he sort of lashes out those verses, what we read in verse 15 about dragging him, kicking and screaming to hell. That's where that comes from. He sort of revisited the pain in his mind, and he just kind of lashes out against his friend at that moment. But it's there in verse 16 that the poem really takes a radical turn. Like, I think what we see is really interesting. For the first 15 verses, like David has just been pouring out what's in his heart. He's been venting, he's just been processing, he's been just sort of giving all of that stuff to God, just clearing the decks. And then it's almost like he gets to verse 16 and he's got nothing left to give out. And all he's left with, he's sort of swept things away, and what he's left with is the bedrock foundation of his life, which for David is faith in God. And trust that God is who he says he is and that God can come to his aid. It's like he had to kind of get all the hurt and the emotion and give that over to God so that he could get back to what was there at the base. Now, have you guys ever had an experience like that? You know, sometimes we just need to do that, right? We get hurt and we just need a moment to cry and scream and yell and just kind of blah and vent and get it all out. And when we do that, it's like you can take a deep breath and all of a sudden you can think a little bit more clearly. You can see a little bit more clearly. And what happens with David then when he does that is he realizes that something has changed, that he can move forward from this hurt. But the crazy thing is nothing's changed around him. He's still running for his life. His son is still leading this coup against him. His most trusted advisor has still betrayed him. But what's changed is more on the inside. What's changed is that David has realized that God is a God who can be trusted, right? That he remembers who God is and what God has done for him. All the things he's done in the past. And because of that, he has trust and faith that he can ask God for help in the present and that God is going to come through. That's what gives him the confidence to ask for help. That's what reminds him that ultimately God is greater than any of our hurts. It's because of who he is and what he's done in the past that we can have the confidence to move forward after that loss and hurt. And look at verse 16 where David begins to do that, kind of begins to move forward after giving this over to God. And look at what he says. He says, as for me, I call to God and the Lord saves me. Evening, morning, and noon, I cry out in distress and he hears my voice. He rescues me unharmed from the battle waged against me, even though many oppose me. God who is enthroned from of old, God who does not change. This God, he's going to hear them and humble them because they have no fear of God. I mean, look what David does. He remembers that God, the God who's been on the throne, who's been ruling things for a long, long time, that God will not change. And it's to that God that David cries out in morning and noon and night and says, come to my aid, take this hurt, help me move forward. And he does that trusting that God is going to be able to help him. And look at kind of how he resolves things. You skip down to verse 22 and you get near the end of the poem itself. And look what he says. He says, cast your cares on the Lord and he will sustain you. He will never let the righteous be shaken. And then just a verse later, he finalizes the poem this way. He says, but as for me, I'll trust in you. Look at that. Cast your cares on the Lord and he will sustain you. That's a pretty incredible line. And the other interesting thing to notice here is that David has kind of shifted once again. He's not talking to God anymore. He's not even talking to the friend who betrayed him. And he's not just talking in general. David is back on the throne as king, and he's starting to issue some commands again, right? This is a command. It's an invitation to us. He says, cast your cares on the Lord. It's almost like he's saying, look, you guys need to remember what I've remembered. He's envisioning the people who are going to read this poem, and even people like us 3,000 years later who are reading it, and saying, I want to invite you to do what I have done. I want to invite you to cast your cares on the Lord. And remember that when you do that, he will sustain you. Cast your cares on the Lord. Now, if you have been in church for a while, that phrase, cast your cares on him, that might sound familiar. And one of the reasons that might sound familiar is that in an early Christian letter that we have that was written by a man named Peter, that we have recorded in the New Testament, he quotes this line, right? So this verse shows up again in the Bible. And what Peter does is really interesting. He quotes it this way. He says, cast all your cares on him because he cares for you. And I think what Peter is doing is he's kind of sort of giving us a little sermon on David's psalm in one verse. He takes that quote, cast all your cares on him. But remember, Peter's a good Jewish boy. So he would have grown up knowing this psalm inside and out, backwards and forwards, like he would have known them all, because these were the songs that he sang in church when he was a kid. These are the words, the truth about God that he knew in his mind and his heart. So at this point in the letter, he wants to communicate this idea. We can cast our cares on God. So he quotes it. And then it's almost like he stops and thinks, you know, if I had to summarize Psalm 55 as a whole, in just a couple of words, how would I do it? And I think he chooses to summarize it this way by saying, we can cast our cares on him because he cares for us. Right? For him, that's the message that you get in that psalm. Ultimately, that is the reason why God is greater than our hurts. We can cast our cares on him because he cares for you. Right? Because he cares for me. Because he cares for all of us more than we are ever going to know. Right? If you read through the book of Psalms as a whole, an idea that you come to over and over and over again is that our God is a God of unfailing love, of unfailing care. Our God is a God of this never giving up on you even when the going gets tough kind of love. And Peter says ultimately that's why we can put our trust and faith in him. That's why we can find a way to move forward in the midst of our pain and hurt, because we can cast all of that on him and then trust that he's going to care for us and that he is going to help us as we move forward. So this is how I think we can put that into practice. Right? When an earthly friend betrays us, and that's going to happen because we get betrayed and we betray each other. We are broken people. One of the things that can help us pick up the pieces and begin to move forward again is to simply do what David did here. To remember that the way to kind of access the fact that God is greater than our hurts is to cast our cares on him and let him care for us. Right? Maybe we need to actually do what David did, just vent. I mean, just get it out. Say, God, this is how I'm feeling. I want you to know. I want you to know what this hurt is. I want you to know what I'm experiencing. Because once we do that, we find ourselves in a place where when we're not hanging on to that anymore, right, our hands are empty and they're open to receive the love and the care that God has for us. In a sense, I think about this whole process, and it's kind of like what all of us who are parents know to be true. Right? So Martha and I, we've got 4 kids, 12 and under. And I think over the years, every single one of them has come home from, school or a play date or a slumber party or something like that. And they come into our room and they just open up, right? Maybe they're crying or they're hurt, but they just start talking about the things that have hurt them. My friend said this, or they all got invited to the party and I didn't get invited. And they just kind of open up to us about their hurt. And what do we do as parents? Martha and I do what a lot of you all have done over the years too. We listen. We hold them, we love them, we give them advice and encouragement when we feel like they're open to advice and encouragement, but mainly we just provide a listening ear, and we keep our arms around them, and we let them know that we're with them, and that we're never going to leave them, that they can always come to us with their hurts, and that ultimately it's going to get better, and that we will be right there with them every step of the way. And if Martha and I, right, who are very imperfect parents, can do that with our kids, can't God, who's really a perfect father, do that for all of the children that he loves? Of course he can, and he can do it so much more than we can and so much better than we can. And ultimately, that's how we can experience the fact that God is greater than our hurts, by casting our cares on him and letting him care for us, letting him help us move forward. So what does this mean in practical terms? Does this mean that it's really a simple equation? If we cast our cares on God, all of a sudden the pain and the hurt and the consequences of what's going on around us, those things just magically go away? Does that mean if we cast our care on God, we get our marriage back, our friendship back, our finances back, the trust back? No, it's not how it works. It's not sort of a magic formula. But instead what we find when we cast our cares on God is that we realize that our cares, even though some of those things don't go away, they're not going to overpower us anymore. They're not going to overwhelm us anymore. And we realize that we are not alone in this anymore, that God himself is with us, he loves us, he cares for us, and that's enough. Right? Somehow that is enough. Somehow we can know that that will always be enough. So what do you need to do with this as we prepare to leave today? In just a moment, the musicians are going to come up and we're going to sing a final song together that really does remind us that the God who is there, who wants to hear about what hurts us, who wants to know what's going on, that he is a good, good father who's perfect in all of his ways. But as we do that, I just want to invite you to think about what you need to do to move forward with what you've heard today. Maybe you're here and you've got some hurts that you just haven't quite figured out what to do with. Well, in a moment, as we pray and as we sing, I just want to invite you to start that conversation with God of casting those cares on him and knowing that you can do that and trust him because he cares for you. Or maybe you're here this morning and you are the one who has hurt someone else. You are the one who has betrayed someone else. And you realize that you've got some work to do to find forgiveness from God and to try to make things right with the person that you hurt. Well, let that be the conversation that you start with today. Again, you can find forgiveness from God. He's not this angry father who's waiting up there with that lightning bolt just ready to go to smite you. No, just like he loves those who are hurting, he loves those who have hurt others as well and wants all of us to find hope and new life and forgiveness in him. And if you are here this morning and have never found hope and new life in Jesus Christ through the relationship that God offers us through the life and death and resurrection of his son, we just would encourage you today to make this today where you take that step, where you invite him and his help and his power into your life. You can do that as we sing. And as always, if it would be a help to any of you for any reason to pray with someone, as you leave today after the song, you can head out those doors, take a right. You can head to the prayer room. There'll be some people there who would consider it an incredible honor to listen and to pray with you about any decision you might be making or any struggle you might be facing. So as the musicians come forward, would you pray with me? Father, thank you. I thank you for the opportunity that we have to be reminded that we can bring our hurts, even the deep ones, to you because you care for us, because you love us. God, there's a lot of people in this room who've probably been hurt and betrayed in a lot of different ways, and for some of us that happened a long time ago. For some of us that memory is still fresh. But what does not change, even though our stories are all different, is the fact that you are a God of unfailing love, that you are a God who cares for us, that you are perfect in all of your ways, and that we can bring those things to you and find hope and find healing, find forgiveness for ourselves when it is needed, find a way to forgive others when they've hurt us too, as that's needed, and that God, in your strength and power, we can move forward. So we just pray, Lord, that as we finish up this time and as we sing this song today, that you would help us know what it looks like to move forward in this truth and to experience your love and your grace and your help in a deeper way today. Amen. Would you all stand as we sing?